Something different tonight, taking a break from the old money topics. There is something other than money. As I was talking to Paul, I've been reading a fascinating book called Chasing Daylight. The CEO was given a death sentence, a few months to live. His mindset goes from what am I going to do 6 months from now when interest rates go down, or 2 years from now when my kid is this age, or 10 years from now, I'm going to do this, to I only got months. And I don't know if I'm even going to be able to walk after two, bringing it back to that mindset, a stoic mindset. Mementi mori, time is fleeting. Be cognizant of your death and how you go about life. I asked Paul to come on. He's a great example of money was a big thing to you at one time. I'll let Paul tell his story, but
Yeah.
at some point, and I think why you join a group like ours is we all evolve together, and it's not really about money. It's about social relationships and personal development mostly. Take it away, Paul.
Thanks for inviting me, and thank you guys for tuning in. I was going to share my story, my journey here. This presentation will be more about the personal development side, as that's what I've been focused on for the past couple of years. And hopefully, I'll share some personal stories, anecdotes, but hopefully, share some practical things that I've learned along the way. And in particular, sharing how some of these ancient wisdom and principles can be combined with modern insights and hopefully help us all lead more balanced and like holistically successful lives. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this feeling. You achieve something and you do it, but you still feel a bit incomplete after that high has worn off. Right. So it's a feeling that I've experienced and it led me to discover a deeper path. A bit about me. I am a physician by background. I did my training in New York City. After that, I joined a pretty busy group practice in the area, and it didn't take very long to realize that scene wasn't for me. Healthcare already at that time was becoming very profit driven. They give you like 15 minutes per follow up. It was more about just getting the patients in and out the door. And I knew that this wasn't why I signed up to be a doctor. Right? So I knew like less than a year in that like I had to do something else. I ended up pursuing further studies in medical acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine. I thought back to an experience during an elective in medical school when I got to go to Shanghai, China to learn acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. And when I was there, I saw how they blended East and West. Stroke patients would get aspirin and antiplatelets along with herbs. That was the inspiration for me to think about doing something similar in New York. So I took a big risk and I ended up quitting that job and starting up my own practice at the time, which didn't take insurance. People thought I was nuts and my wife was still in training. I was the main breadwinner at the time and people thought I was nuts, but it's something that I had to do. And the risk paid off. The practice took off and I got really busy. Fast forward to 2019, both my wife and I were having thriving practices. We had two young kids. We were both really active as well outside of work. We were doing marathons. I had just run the Boston Marathon that year. I was even coaching cross country for my town's high school team. To the outside, people thought, wow, you guys are a power couple. Everything was getting done. Like the kids were getting to school activities, everything was going well, except our marriage, which was suffering from neglect because we actually didn't have time to nurture the most important relationship of all, like the one with each other. It got to the point where we considered separation and divorce. I remember sitting at the table looking at real estate, our houses, thinking we need to stay in town to be with kids. We don't want to disrupt their life too much. It got to the point and it made us both question the cost of professional success on our well being and happiness.
Sometimes people don't realize they're making bad decisions until it's done and then realize it after the fact. What specifically in your case was it that you broke it down to back then? It might trigger something for somebody.
Yeah, it all came to a head. We realized we got to this point where we were leading parallel lives, living in the same house, taking care of the kids, but we drifted apart. We became different people. We didn't know what was going on in each other's worlds. We didn't have many deep conversations, right? Things were just getting done. And when it came down to it, we didn't spend quality time together. We were doing errands and other things, but quality time wasn't there. Unfortunately, you don't realize it until things blow up. And you wonder, how did we get to this point?
I think everybody here has gone through the issues. If you don't, you're
Yeah.
probably just unaware. I remember
Right.
my we had I had a like a marriage counselor, one of those people tell me marriage is not supposed to be like a well-oiled machine where everybody
Mhm.
has their roles and doesn't really need to interact and do
Yeah.
stuff. I'm a systems guy, and if I could, I'd probably live my life through a Google Calendar that's shared amongst
Mhm.
everybody, but apparently that's not how you're supposed to do things.
We had a choice to make. Some friends recommended one way. We decided to trust our gut, even if the chance of success was low. We thought, you know what, if there's even like a small chance that we can put in the work and actually end up with a much stronger marriage than before, even if that's a 1% chance, I like those odds because it means there's a chance, right? Let's put in the work and see if this is possible. 'Cause that's what we heard from people who specialize in couples therapy, right? Working with couples that undergo this stuff, as opposed to listening to popular psychology or advice, which encourages people to separate and to divorce. It's almost that's almost like the easier route rather than to take responsibility for the role that you have to play instead of just blaming the other person and putting in the work. Right? That's when we decided to go to couples therapy. We also invested in individual therapy. I turned to learning about life coaching, personal development, and went back to a framework in traditional Chinese medicine that really encompassed a lot of things. And ironically, even though I was using this framework to treat my patients and prescribe medicines and to do acupuncture, I never really thought about it in a way, in the life coaching way. That framework is called the five elements. The five elements are wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. It's a framework that's actually been used for millennia, from everything from traditional Chinese medicine to acupuncture to nutrition, philosophy, psychology, martial arts, feng shui, architecture in Asia, and even urban planning. Right. So, in short, each element represents a different part of us. Right. Each element corresponds to a different part of our neurobiology, our personalities, our physical health, and fundamental human needs. We all need to pay attention to each of these elements, and life is more healthy and more balanced when we pay attention to each of these, right? And we can't neglect any of these. And I'm going to go into more detail here. All right. So the first element is wood in nature. It represents growth, vision, and adaptability. It's the element that pushes us to break through limitations and constantly seek new opportunities. In my life, wood has always been strong. I realized this studying Chinese medicine, right? With each element, it's associated with certain strengths, but also certain pitfalls, right? For wood, it's exemplified by visionary leadership, again, growth and drive. So a lot of business owners, a lot of entrepreneurs are very strong in wood. The pitfalls are anger, frustration, or overdominance. If imbalanced, then you could be indecisive or passive. Each element is associated with a different part of our neurobiology. So for wood, the what this represents is neuroplasticity, right? Our body's ability to form new connections and adapt to new experiences. When looking at different life philosophies, the overlaps are Kaizen, the Japanese philosophy of continuous improvement, and Ikigai, which is purpose driven life. Humanism, focused on personal growth and human potential. When I was growing up, my parents were incredibly strict, especially my father. I was the youngest of three boys. Both my older brothers went to Princeton. One graduated top three in his class. Right. I never seemed to measure up to that level of academic success. The less I succeeded, the tighter my parents' grip became. By the end of middle school, going into high school, my father installed physical locks on every door and window of the house. The idea was to keep me inside, focused on my studies, away from my distractions. Even the power cord to the TV was locked in a box that required a key. The phone lines were tapped with a recording device that would automatically capture every conversation, like if you pick up the phone. So it's pretty intense. And all of these safeguards were meant to ensure that I would spend that time like studying math or vocabulary. But it made my home feel like a prison. I dreaded being there. I'd rather be at school. What happens? The only chance to escape was when my parents were at work. With all doors locked, I searched the house basement for any tool I found, perfectly shaped thin piece of metal that I could use to shimmy open the door. I learned pick locks with credit cards and paper clips. I still have a chip on my tooth from shaping like a paper clip, right, which I used to ultimately open the lock that was guarding the TV cable. I figured out how to break into my parents' bedroom to turn off the phone tapping device so that I could actually make calls to my friends without being recorded. Right. Each time I did this, my heart would be racing and my hands would be just sweaty. Like I'd be shaking in fear because with my dad, if I ever got caught, I would get like a really good thrashing for sure. But there was also like a thrill to it, right? Like the thrill of breaking free, even if the consequences were severe. Corporal punishment was common growing up, like anything less than an A, I would make sure to get it. I knew the stakes were high, but I wanted the fresh air and freedom. Right? Growing up, I was an angry kid. On the surface, I was obedient, seemingly calm, but inside I was burning with rage. I really envied my friends who had normal parents, kids who could play sports or hang out after school. And meanwhile, I'm locked up at home doing algebra and calculus. That anger pushed me to find ways to escape and claim small little victories. And I think in the long run, it actually taught me things like patience, resourcefulness, and the ability to take calculated risks and to create my own path, not live by somebody else's definition of success. The reason I bring up this story is that much like a plant breaking through concrete, we all have this ability to break free from limitations imposed on us, whether that is by our own limiting beliefs or by others. And I bring the story up because it connects to what is my strongest element, which is wood, right? Which represents again growth, vision, and adaptability. So the next element along the pathway here is fire. And so fire represents passion, joy, and connectedness, right? Being our authentic selves, right? Connecting to things that actually make us innately happy, right? So fire people picture these as the people who can just light up a room, right? A lot of extroverts are fire people, fire folks, and they just have this infectious nature to them. So I know Lane, your wife, has a very nice fire element. Gets along with everyone, can just make people feel at ease. So that's an example of a good fire element. The pitfalls of fire folks is that the fire can burn too intensely if you don't balance it. Fire folks are prone to anxiety, restlessness, being impulsive, or burning out. From a neuroscience perspective, fire corresponds to our emotional regulation networks and all the neurochemicals associated with that. Again, with different philosophies, there's some overlap here. Ubuntu from Africa stresses community and interconnectedness, right? There is no like, individual. Everyone is part of a community. Again, ikigai is also involved, right? That talks about finding your passion through meaningful purpose. And then Epicureanism, it's finding joy in simple pleasures of life. One question I would ask is, what's one area in life where you could bring more passion and authenticity? When I was growing up, there was very little fire. Fire was not encouraged. I don't remember my parents smiling much because the mentality was life is hard. If you're smiling, that means like you're you're neglecting some other area for life. You're not working hard enough towards your goals. All right. Next, the third element, Earth, is all about grounding, nurturing, and stability. It's the element that helps us take care of those around us. But to do that, we first have to take care of ourselves. So when Earth is out of balance, we become overwhelmed by worry or neglect our needs. So pitfalls for Earth people is that these are your worry warts, right? These are your sort of overprotective parents, helicopter parents smothering when their Earth element is out of balance. The key to remember if you're an Earth person is that self care is not selfish. It's actually necessary before you can effectively help others. Otherwise, you're going to burn out. And you have to nurture yourself first for lasting success. Again, there's a neuroscience corollary here with a pathway and a system called the default mode network in our brains. And the practice of gratitude. This also overlaps with the Japanese concept of ikigai and Confucianism, that which is all about social harmony, family roles, and community stability.
Funny you said the helicopter parent. I think
Yeah.
all of us know that term and try and stay away from it, but I've heard it's morphed into the, lawnmower parent. You heard of this? It's like you're the parent and you, like, lawnmower, like, fresh cut grass in front of your kids so that you take away all their barriers, all the hard things, the nicest
Mhm.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. So next, we got metal. Metal is all about clarity, precision, and the ability to let go. Right? It's the element that helps us release what no longer serves us and brings order into our lives. So, a lot of good qualities about metal, but the potential pitfalls is that if it's overactive, leads to rigid thinking and grief and resistance to change. This correlates with the executive function networks in our brains, which governs like, decision making, our focus, and our ability to not be too impulsive and to be in control of our emotions. When we're talking about philosophies that correlate with this, we think of things like minimalism, stoicism, and even Confucianism in the part that it's about ethics and principles. One thing when we think about metal is what's one limiting belief or story holding you back from achieving the life of your dreams, right? And that actually no longer serves you and can be released. And finally, we have water, which is all about like intuition, emotional depth, and the ability to adapt to life's challenges. Right? It's about going with the flow and embracing change. Right? Water is powerful. Bruce Lee's famous quote where he says, "Be water, my friend." That's a testament to how powerful water is. But for water folks, if it's out of balance, then you can become fearful. You can be easily overwhelmed. And this corresponds to the limbic system in our brains, which manages emotions and stress. There's overlap with kintsugi, which is, again, the Japanese principle of embracing your imperfections because imperfections and failures actually makes you a more resilient person, right? Like failures and cracks make a more beautiful product in the end, right? You have the Taoist principle of wu wei, effortless action and adaptability. Taoism is all about harmony, being one with your environment and flowing with life's changes. And then the European principles of Hager, which is just surrender and trust. For most of my life, as I mentioned, anger was my dominant emotion. On the outside, everyone said I'm easygoing and friendly, very calm, like they could never imagine me raising my voice. Deep down, I had a chip on my shoulder and a lot of resentment. Everything shifted in 2004 when my mom came home one day from work to discover that my father had committed suicide. It was definitely, to say it was a shock is an understatement. But his death really affected my trajectory in life after that because it really made me commit to and pay attention to the importance of mental health. I vowed I would never put my family through that. I learned a hard lesson about the fleeting nature of life. He spent years working so hard to save for retirement. He had dreams of going back to his homeland to retire by the coast, but he never got to enjoy it. He never made it to retirement age. For years, I held on to deep anger towards both of my parents, but after my dad left us, a lot of that anger went towards my mom. Even though in the past few years, I put in so much work towards personal development, I realized that still, whenever I visited my mom, I would just so easily get triggered by something she would say, right? It would usually be something that is judgmental or critical, and it would just cut me really deeply, right? Even though I had spent all this work on personal development. And it just reminded me that, you know what, I might have come far, but the fact that I'm so easily triggered and still hurt by her just pressing my buttons made me realize, okay, like there's still a lot of work I need to do on myself. I was still holding a lot of anger despite the strides I had made. Last year, I did Tony Robbins' Date with Destiny, and there was this exercise called like effective blaming. Right? It's about recognizing that life doesn't happen to us; it happens for us. If we blame someone for the negative, we also have to acknowledge that the good that came from it. Being locked up in a house, like I felt like I was in a prison. I realized that actually that there's some good that came out of it. Made me very resourceful, made me very patient, made me like a calculated risk taker, which I think served me well later on in life. So I decided when I learned about this exercise, I'm going to try this on my mom. And then I decided to write a letter because I knew that if I like talked to her, like she would just immediately react and it would probably be really ugly. I think if I wrote her a letter, she can't respond right away. She has to process it. In my letter, I laid it all out. I didn't hold back. I blamed my mom and dad for all the pressure they placed on me and all the feeling unloved, just how unfair life was, all the bad, right? I listed all the specific instances in my mind, but I also blame them for all the good, right? For making me like resilient, resourceful, and for teaching me to define success on my own terms. Writing that letter was a huge moment of release. It really wasn't, it was more for me rather than her because I had no idea how she would respond. I realized holding on to all this anger was hurting me more than anyone else. A couple of days later, she responded, and I was really floored by how she responded. She essentially acknowledged everything that I wrote, said, "Yes, everything you wrote is true." And she took responsibility for causing me pain, asked for my forgiveness, and said that I didn't do anything wrong and that it's understandable given what I had been through. I never thought my mom would respond like that. I never thought that I would actually reconcile with her like that. And not only did it change everything about our relationship, but it felt like the biggest burden was like lifted off of my shoulders. And I knew that was the case because ever since then, every time I visit her, even if she says something that would have once like pressed my buttons, I'm just in such a different space. I have empathy when she says something hurtful. Right? I no longer get triggered. There's so much more peace, understanding, and joy. For years, I was all about wood. Even Tony Robbins calls himself a wood person. A lot of entrepreneurs and business leaders like are wood. And I was like, yeah, go wood's the best, right?
Yeah, they're usually trying to prove somebody wrong or there's some kind of anger or fire.
For so many years, I was driven by this chip on my shoulder.
You were led by the dark side. Yeah.
Exactly. Metal was one of my weaker elements. In the five elements model, metal balances wood. I used to hate metal people. They're so rigid, black and white. These all about following rules, rigid. Whereas I'm more about what life is just different shades of gray, right? Everything is nuanced. Nothing is absolute. Naturally, I had trouble getting along with metal people. Ironically, metal is my wife's strongest element, but that's a discussion for another day. I finally learned to embrace metal when I thought back to this framework because metal is about letting go. The biggest thing holding me back was me holding on to anger and resentment. I had to learn to let go to find peace. Forgiveness was my way of releasing that baggage. Once I did the final obstacle with my mom and that letter, it allowed me to move forward, right? Forgiveness requires deep emotional introspection. Water is the element of emotional depth and healing. And so, in that process of forgiving my mom, I also had to forgive myself. I had to take responsibility because I was clinging to this belief that, like, I'm the most important, right? Only my perspective is the valid one. I didn't even think to look at things from my parents' viewpoint, right? I didn't even think to consider how much they had struggled, how much they had suffered in their lifetimes coming here as new immigrants to a new country. They didn't have access to the tools we have now. They had to deal with their generational trauma. Right? They tried their best. I was blinded because I clung to this story that, gosh, like I grew up in such a tough environment, like life wasn't fair. I had this victim mentality, right? So I had to forgive myself and take responsibility for that, right? And that's the whole process. Besides metal and water, I think was also very much linked to earth because earth is about self care. We have to take care of ourselves before we can take care of others. Heal your own emotional wounds before you can effectively help others. That's what gave me peace and stability that had eluded me for so long. We talk about the final element, fire. It was just so much easier to feel joy, to feel passion, to feel connected with others. Like when you don't have that like, weight of like emotional baggage. Even visits to my mom became joyful, not tense. This whole process just made me realize that when we balance all of our elements, it actually makes your dominant element stronger. It's not this zero sum mentality where if you focus on one thing, you're giving up something else. It's quite the opposite. When you focus on things that aren't your strong suit, it makes your natural strengths even greater. The reason I bring this story up is sometimes the key to growth isn't just focusing on what comes naturally or what we're good at. It's when we work on areas where we're deficient or have blind spots, those elements that don't come naturally to us. By focusing on what we need to balance, I think, yeah, we end up strengthening not only those areas, but our strengths as well. Everything flows more naturally. And that's where I found that like true holistic success and wellness comes from. Like when everything is working in harmony, not just the thing that you're naturally good at or focused on. So now that I covered the elements, we can talk about some ways that you can identify your imbalances in life through your physical signs. This overlaps with acupuncture or Chinese medicine. Right? For a lot of acupuncturists, you're actually thinking in terms of elements. Right? Each element corresponds to different organ systems. For example, people prone to headaches and muscle tightness in their jaw or shoulders. And this is because the meridians corresponding to that actually run through, for example, your shoulder blades or the side of your head, your temples where you tend to have tension headaches, right? If you're a fire person, like those meridians, a lot of them tend to run through your heart. So those people tend to have a greater risk of like high blood pressure, heart disease when they get older, right? Earth people tend to have more digestive issues. You're more prone to easily gaining weight or losing weight. Metal people are more prone to asthma, allergies. Water people are more prone to kidney or genital urinary issues, low back pain, easily tired. So that's the cool thing I found with Chinese medicine is that a lot of our physical symptoms actually give clues about inner balance. It's not just a symptom, it's a clue something is out of balance. Right? You can address it with medicine or you can address it with lifestyle. So for each different element, there's different ways that you can support it. Right. But also remember that let's say your dominant element is out of balance, right? Oftentimes, an equally, if not more effective way is to focus on the elements that actually support it, right? So if we go back to this slide, we'll take an example. Let's say you're a wood dominant person like myself. Notice that water is the element that feeds into it, right? Water is part of the generating cycle. You got metal here, which is part of the controlling cycle. Metal will help control the excesses of wood. Water will help nurture it. Right? So if you're a wood person like myself, a good strategy is besides focusing on things that nourish your wood, focus on things that are good for water and metal. Right? Those link to wood. Right? This is a primer into how traditional Chinese medicine works. The same principles can apply to our lives. Balance isn't a one-time thing that you do. It's something that ideally we should cultivate every day through small intentional actions, right? Something to think about is what routines or habits can you introduce into your days to strengthen the elements that feel deficient or neglected. Once we recognize and nurture each element, true holistic success becomes attainable. Each element supports and balances the others. When one element is out of balance, the others are affected as well. So true holistic success and wellness comes from when we nurture all aspects of life and bring them into harmony. So if any of you are curious about discovering more about your own dominant, I created a quiz on my website. It takes 10 minutes, but you can go on there and figure out, hey, what are my primary and secondary elements? 10, 15 minutes, it's pretty fun. You can get insight into yourself. The goal isn't an equal score in everything, but to learn your natural strengths so you can be aware moving forward. What are things that you might need to pay attention to? I also wrote a chapter in a book about this topic. It's called The Life Coach's Toolkit, Volume 3. I wrote the last chapter. And lastly, Lane and I do a podcast about these concepts and more regarding holistic success, fulfillment, and everything around it. Check
Yeah.
us out.
The cool thing, you meet people on the same journey after a couple of years. Some people drift off, but you meet people on the same journey and then you start to get to different things you try to tackle in life. This personal development stuff, a handful of us has gone to like the Tony Robbins shtick, and it's great. I think of those things like you just do it once in a while. The reason I did the podcast with Paul is I realized it takes time, but I have to put effort into it consistently. We don't do many podcasts, maybe one every 2 weeks. Paul's always trying to get me to do more. But what he doesn't realize is like we record it and I got to listen to the whole damn thing again for the second time when I edit it. So I'm getting double than he is. It's funny. I'll edit it weeks, months later. It's all
Mm.
fresh to me, constantly hearing the same stuff. It's been good going back and forth with Paul live because most people, they blame it on other people. They're not going through life just on autopilot, where I think most of us here have the ability, or at least to try to be more conscious. But unfortunately, you're going to regress back to your mean or your five people you hang out with most. That was my conscious thing I did to invest in this area. But I think what you realize, like high net worth people, the ones that weren't given the money, these values or these habits that people do are it's very consistent with high level people.
Yeah, I think said, and I think when you talk about you are the average of the 5 people you hang around. This model of the elements, it's something I think about when I think about the 5 people in my circle, right? Because none of us are strong in all five. We're naturally good at one, maybe two. It's interesting to look at your friends and think about, okay, what are their strong elements? Then you see, oh wow, this person compliments me well, or I might be missing fire and this person brings a lot of fire. And you get to see and appreciate how different people bring different energies into your life and enhance it, right? We are all social creatures. We need other people, and you get to see and appreciate how other people can make you whole.
Yeah, I think of that as like the law of limiting associations. You are the five people you're with most, but maybe you want a guy in there that doesn't really care about anything materialistic or even having a high flying career. And you want a part of that in your life. So you have them around. But
Yeah.
when it gets to be after 1 a.m., you peace out. You go off your own way, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. If you're talking about only one thing all the time, life's going to get pretty boring. It's going to get kicking up with repetitive. Variety is the spice of life. Right?
You mentioned that you and your wife decided to work on the marriage.
Mhm.
Can you give a little bit more insight to the kind of work that you did and then how you started to make changes and how you saw that affecting the relationship?
Thanks for that question. My wife and I did something called the Gottman method. We tried a couple of therapists first and realized, okay, this one's not for us. And then one of my wife's good friends, who happens to be a psychologist, when she learned that we were going through trouble, she opened up about her own difficulties with her husband. And because she's a psychologist, she had known about the Gottman method. And so she highly recommended this approach, which is scientifically based. I think, especially for a lot of us, there's a lot of professionals here, a lot of engineers, folks in the medical field. We want something that's more scientifically based. Right? John and Julie Gottman, they studied literally like thousands of couples and they nailed it down to a few things where it could observe a couple arguing. Within minutes, they could predict with 90% certainty whether or not this couple would make it just based on how couples interacted and when they fought. So we found a Gottman certified therapist, went through the program. We even did an intensive retreat down in Maryland where for 8 hours a day, we sat with a therapist. It was like an autopsy of our lives, childhoods, everything that made us tick like the way that we did. And in doing so, we learned so much about like each other, about ourselves, and the level of conversations that we had from that and after that was far deeper than in the 10 plus years we were married before. The level of insight we gained from working with professionals was truly profound. I found so much value from the Gottman method. Like I ended up like doing training in it myself because I just thought it's so useful, and felt like this is the stuff everyone should be taught. They don't teach us any of this in school, right? At least half the stuff they teach us in school is like outdated. It's practically useless nowadays. No one teaches us life skills, so how to get along with people, especially in today's world where the divorce rate is so high. Right? Levels of unhappiness, levels of anxiety are so high.
Every time I hear that story, Paul, it's common. You get to that point where things are tough. I don't know why people tell me their problems all the time. I hear this so many times. You guys were lucky where both parties were willing to work at it. In most cases, there's just so much scar tissue on both sides. You just can't really move on. And that's why if you're listening to this, maybe ask yourself, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe I don't not saying you need to go on a retreat, but maybe just watch a few YouTube on the Gottman stuff
Mhm.
or Gary Chapman, get some new ideas, have a discussion. Even if it's not that bad now, my whole point is once you get enough scar tissue, you're just screwed.
Even if one person wants to make changes, if they do internal work, like you talked about the relationship with your mom, just that internal work for you changed the dynamic of your relationship. So I think one person in a relationship can change the dynamic. You don't have to settle for how it is. But I just get a follow up question. Maybe could you? It sounds like you've grown and developed like relationship skills. Could you just talk a little bit like what kind of things you learned going through the development program in your practical day to day, like how you were before? And then actually, like, how did you change that in practice?
We did a lot of therapy sessions. The most memorable ones were where the Gottman coach would tell us to bring up a contentious topic and start arguing. She would coach us and see how we argue, how we fight, because fights are inevitable in all relationships. One of their big things is that most conflicts in marriages or intimate relationships are inherently unresolvable, right? And that's normal because we're different people. How do we manage those differences without getting into the four horsemen, right? Criticism, contempt, defense, and stonewalling, right? So these are the four things that they narrow down to where they could observe couples fighting. And depending on how much of these four things they saw, they could determine if a couple would make it. A lot of our work involved getting coached. I remember times when the Gottman coach would have to tell him, stop my wife. Hey, hold up. Rephrase that. That came off a bit harsh, right? That came off as a criticism. She would have to start over. We would chuckle because we're both going through it. Gradually, we didn't need a coach anymore. We were able to practice this in our daily lives. Right? If my wife says something harsh, I'll jokingly tell her, hey, that came off a bit harsh. That was a criticism. Can you reframe that? She'd be like, oh, yeah, you're right. Let me reframe that. Instead of saying, you're so messy, she would have to rephrase it to, for example, something like, I feel really frustrated when I come home and your socks are on the ground, right? I'm just making something up. We learned that in a heated argument, one of the strategies you can do is like a timeout, right? Just say, hey, I need a few minutes. Can we talk about it in 5? And that's a good strategy because when both people are in fight or flight mode, it's neurologically impossible to come to any sort of consensus or to have the level of empathy or like higher level thinking to actually be able to resolve something. There's a scientific reason why it's useful to hold off on an argument until cortisol levels drop. We were intentional about practicing it in our daily lives, and there's other useful tools as well, right? So, for example, what I would call the 5 minute exercise, right? So you let your partner talk uninterrupted for 5 minutes or however long it takes to give their point of view. You don't say anything. At the end, you have to repeat back, summarize their point of view to their satisfaction. Once that happens, then you take turns. Right? Techniques like this, it fosters a mutual understanding and helping you see the other side of the coin, right? See how your partner sees something. When you do something as simple as that, your quote unquote fights are gonna in general end up much differently than if you don't do something like that. Yeah. So a lot of these, they're not rocket science. I think it's just being aware of these tools and frameworks studied across thousands of couples. Yeah.
But how have you taken these relationship communication skills that you've learned from going this program? How have you been able to apply that in a professional sense or with like other people outside of your, I guess, family?
Yeah, it's love that question because even though these skills are meant for couples, but I think they're actually so relevant even for friends, even amongst colleagues. All the more important in a group like business setting where the stakes can be high. We talk about the idea of like crucial conversations. Like sometimes you only got one shot at a conversation. You don't want to mess it up, right? All it takes is for your delivery to come off harsh, critical, or condescending, and that conversation is gone. The recipient is left with a negative feeling. These principles are relevant in business settings where you don't have the benefit all the time of having like opportunities to go back to rehash that argument. You might not get the opportunity to be like, oh, hey, that conversation didn't go so well. Let's just try this again. How often can you do that with a superior, a manager or a boss, right? You got one shot in a lot of cases where you want to just really get it off like the first time. Yeah. Being able to deliver things in a nice way, like when you disagree with somebody. I think these are just really important skills. So versatile, so applicable.
It's harder to deal with your spouse. That's the hardest.
Agreed. Yeah, because their spouse knows how to press your buttons, right?
Well, because there's
Yeah.
contempt, there's baggage, and it's the hardest one. Everything is easy, but
Yeah.
that's my opinion. Any other questions or comments?
Hey, Poe, I appreciate you sharing. I was
Yeah.
curious on the elements section.
Yeah.
I don't know, you could go, maybe I'm this, maybe I'm that. And is it something that changes through life? Were you born wood, or you feel like maybe your upbringing brought you that way, or could you or would you want to change, or is that not really? point to point to balance whatever gifts you have, I guess, on that end of things.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the answer is it's a bit of both, right? So I know in ancient medical texts, the belief is that you are born naturally a certain way. Like this is why they're able to look at somebody and just from looking at them, be able to tell with pretty good certainty if you're top one or two elements, right? They can look at someone's body habitus, the way the face is, and come up with it to a reasonable degree. Like, this is probably you. It's interesting. So yes, we're all born with certain strengths, and then as a result, certain predispositions to certain illnesses, which makes sense. Right? If we think about like modern understanding, it's both nature and nurture. We don't know what cards we drew in the DNA lottery, but we're all at risk for certain diseases or ailments when we get older. Right? At the same time, going to the principle of wood and neuroplasticity, we know our bodies and brains are highly adaptable. That's the cool thing about fusing this ancient model with modern understanding because each of these elements corresponds to different major functions of the brain. If we know anything about the brain, you can work on it. You can do remarkable things if we're intentional about nurturing that part of our brains. You can definitely nurture elements and make everything stronger. Metal is not inherently my strong suit. I am not the neatest person. My office is messy. I could use some help with organization and getting things done. I'm really good at thinking of ideas, and sometimes it gets me too much when it comes down to it. And I got to pick the two or three things to focus on. I sometimes have trouble. Knowing that, I can focus and find strategies to help with organization. I can leverage my wife's strengths. Best element is metal. So she's very helpful in helping me get things done. Lane here, he's really organized. He's got great systems. I imagine like a lot of engineers also have good organizational methods. But now I'm able to appreciate that, right? Because I'm able to appreciate that. Oh, hey, like we would be great. We would be great partners for this reason, right? Because our strengths can complement each other. And yeah, so I absolutely learn from other people whose strengths might be naturally like different than mine. Yeah, so it's a cool thing. I think, yeah. So to answer, going back to your question, is a bit of both. We go through different seasons of life, right? I think there's going to be some points in our life where, hey, we're going to be like in a growth mode. You don't always want to be in a growth mode because if you're always in a growth mode, then that's a bit boring, gets tired after a while. But you also want to enjoy the harvest and the fruits of your labor. Right? You do tend to go through all these different seasons of life. You do tend to cycle through each one. You could even apply this five elements model to businesses, right? Wood is your startup phase. Fire is like when it takes off, your company's really expanding, growing fast, right? Earth is harvest season. That's when you reap the rewards of all that expansion. Metal is associated with autumn. That's when you go back to the drawing board. What can we cut out? What isn't working? Where can we trim the fat to make our operations more targeted and lean? Water is about going back to your philosophical roots. Are we really hitting our core mission here? Are we really doing what we set out to do? Now that you have that clarity and that intuition, that you can go back into the growth phase. This model is really applicable in so many ways. We're all going to cycle through all the elements. Right? We're not going to be stuck and stagnant in life.
Thanks, Paul. That sounds good. I suppose you're probably even thinking about some of that with your kids a little. Of course, you're comparing your upbringing, and of course,
Yeah.
you're very aware of that. And whatever we do with our kids, we realize they're going to need counseling down the line, no matter how many we think we did a good job. But of course, your framework of understanding, you have more resources than your parents, right? They didn't know all that. And it's great that you understand that. And one thing I think that's really important that you mentioned, but it's that faith that your wife and you had when you said there may only be 1% chance, but we're going to go after this and whatever your belief system is. And I think that's a big piece of this. Then everybody has their own, whatever you want to call it, whatever that faith-based system is.
Yeah.
But I think that's really crucial. I'm a pilot and I sit next to lots of pilots. I fly all night and I'll probably sit next to 30, 40 different people.
Yeah.
You just hear all their life, whatever that's going on, they're going on. There are a lot of people who've had divorce, different things. And it's interesting because people, they share everything in 4 a.m. going across the Alaskan continent. I will say that people who have that sort of faith, whatever that faith is, it really helps. It gives them that extra push that they can get through things that when they are seemingly insurmountable. And that's just one last, you didn't really mention that, but I think it is an important part of that element thing. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ian. I agree. Like, faith is important. You don't necessarily have to be religious. My wife and I consider ourselves spiritual, but we don't have a religious system to fall back on. It is important to have faith even when we go outside, right? When we're driving on the road and the cars are coming past you on the other side, just within feet of you. If you didn't have faith that the cars are going to cross over, and we know this happens all the time, we would never do anything. We would not even want to go outside. So yeah, you got to have faith in yourself and your ability. Hardships and difficult times build resilience and faith. And that's what you can draw upon so that when you hit the next challenge, and we will all hit challenges in our life, then we have this well of experience that we can go back to, right? Hey, I got through a different situation, but it was tough as hell in the past. I know that I am resourceful enough to get through this. I know that we will make it through. We'll figure a way out. And I think that's where I'm actually thankful for the childhood that I had. And I think that's why I had that mentality of, hey, 1% chance. I like those odds because I'm going to be that 1%. It's not like a coin toss. It's all up to us. How resourceful can we be to find that 1 in 100 chance and make it work? Yeah. Thanks for the question, Ian. Good to see you.
I have a question about the mom thing. We have similar things there. I think you had it worse than me. I don't enjoy going to my mom's house. Maybe you do now these days, apparently. But the before we all go out and write nasty grams to our moms, you said that kind of unlocked things. Why do you think that was the case?
There's something cathartic about letting things off your chest, and especially in a situation like that. I didn't hold back. I had very specific memories and laid it all out. She didn't even refute them. She said, yeah, everything you wrote is true. Then she said, I'm thankful that you turned out like normal. You turned out the way that you, despite me making mistakes and not being there for you. I got to give her credit. Hopefully, when our kids are angry, see their therapists about things we did or didn't do, they'll have that amount of grace. Right. I think it's the whole idea of just letting go, right? I think we all have stories that we tell ourselves. We all have these things that we keep inside that forms our belief system in our life. And some of them work for us and some of them I think we all need to be honest and we need to think, okay, is something that worked for us when we were kids, is it working for us now as adults? And I think we all got to be honest and look at each aspect of our lives and say, hey, am I as fulfilled? Am I as happy as I could be? And if the answer is no in one of the categories, that's a great thing. That's a great opportunity to reflect, to figure out what's the learning opportunity here? What's the opportunity for growth? None of us are perfect. Even though I had made this like big breakthrough with my mom, I'm hoping to look back on this year and be like, oh man, I was such a fool in 2025. I knew nothing. This is just where I'm at in my journey. I appreciate that I'm on this journey. And I think we're all trying to figure our shit out, right? I don't think the journey ever ends. Yeah. So I think just embracing it and just soaking up the wins when we can. I think that's important.
Thank you for sharing this. For me, it does hit home a
Mm,
bit when you reflect about Asian parents, or mine wasn't as hardcore as yours, but I think there was just those things that's, oh, it's forbidden. At 21, it's time to see the world. They're like, no, be home at 10 o'clock, even though when you're already at 21.
yeah.
But again, I think for me, wouldn't be more of like a cultural imbalance, like a cycle, like how my parents probably, and it reflected to me, and how I would reflect it to my kids.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on that? The word I got from you was growth and reflection within what's happening now and the past, and how I embrace that. When you were talking about your story with your wife, I had that instance with my husband. How did you guys make it work? I'm very curious of what element that I have and what element that he has, even though there's already like a nitpick of what you described. I'm
Mm,
going to really definitely go and take that test. But what I'm saying is, we've been married, we're almost married for 22 years, but
yeah. Nice.
there was one point where I had to draw the line and say, yes, we can find money. But I think his perspective, his mindset was always like, what's 5 years, 10 years from now? But for me, it's stay at home mom. There was no conversation. And he was out in the morning, late at night. His home was like Home Depot and Lowe's because he does construction. There was a huge gap. And I was like, I can take care of my kids. You can marry your business. I can figure this out on my own, even though I don't have a job yet. But I am capable. I know what to do, even if I don't have you. If you have a goal like we do, then I also need the moment. And there was no moment. for me. It was always about kids, day and night, kids, and paperwork at home. For a stay-home mom, Elaine, is your wife a stay-home mom?
Yeah,
Is she
yeah,
a stay-home mom? Yes.
and everything you're saying is probably echoed by every single other mom or dad out there. You're saying it nicer than what you probably told your spouse, right?
I was very upfront with him. No cussing, no anything. I don't want this life. I find money elsewhere. If we're not going to hold hands, if I'm not going to agree to what you're doing, yes, I agree to a certain point. I want a better future, but there's got to be a balance. There's got to be boundaries. We had a moment of mediation. We're okay now. But I think there's that moment. I didn't have that great relationship with my parents because all their mindset was coming to America, live the dream. So it's always about work. And I think that hit hard for me.
Thanks for sharing. So much gold in what you said. You're absolutely right. I think probably for a bunch of us here, our parents likely had this scarcity mindset that served them in their era because for a lot of them, they had to value economic stability and certainty, right? So that just surviving, right? Like that took precedence over other things, right?
Yeah, you need to stick with your spouse because if not, you're single and you have much money.
Yeah.
So that's why it makes like these issues become more in the forefront once you have more money because you
Yeah.
got options. You can just leave.
Yeah, totally. And we also, a lot of our parents didn't have the best relationships. It's very hard for us to have role models when it comes to relationships, right? We can easily identify role models in other areas of life. Like, for example, we can be like, oh, I want to be like so and so investor. I want to be like so and so athlete. But for most of us, we don't have role models for our relationships, especially if our parents didn't exactly have the happiest of relationships. And then going into our own lives as adults, unknowingly, we carry over a lot of the same coping mechanisms and the same patterns that we observed from our parents, right? It's not our fault 'cause that's all we knew. It's natural for these tendencies to get passed down to our kids, right? Unless we're intentional about thinking. With my dad committing suicide, that was a stark wake up call. Whatever I observed in my parents did not work. It ended in one taking his own life. Before then, I witnessed a ton of fighting. Things were always being thrown around the house and things were breaking. And then I'll admit that before I really did work on myself, I noticed I was really angry inside. When I was a kid and I was alone and no one saw me, like I would have bouts of rage. And, when I think back, where did I get that from? I got that from my parents because that's how they responded to stress. So no wonder I picked that up. And then I realized with young kids, I'm like, holy shit, if I don't want to be like this around my kids. God forbid, like if I lose control of my anger, my temper, what if something happens? What if I throw something and it accidentally hits them? They would never forget that. Being in the medical field, that statistically, with a parent committing suicide, my risk of suicide depression goes up significantly. I didn't want that. None of us want that. I had a clear idea of what doesn't work. Sometimes when we're hit with a crisis, that's a wake up call to tell you it's different because whatever you think it's not working. I knew I didn't want to end up dead at an early age. I knew I didn't want to leave my kids without a father.
So I think if you guys are dealing with stuff and it is past that point, email, call, pull right away. At least somebody to talk to. It's not any type of replacement for emergency or 911, of course. That's the disclaimer that we have to say every time. But the hard part is if it's not too bad, just something to improve. What's the next actionable step? We're gonna break into groups of 3 or 2. Go around your circle for the time and talk about a takeaway and maybe an action item. Maybe it's just a discussion. Maybe you and your spouse take the quiz and one's metal, one's wood. It doesn't matter what they are. Just get a conversation going. If anything, I'll open the rooms now and you can head in there. Thanks for jumping on this call. Get back to money stuff next week. Good chat, Paul.
Yeah, thanks